everyone, welcome to my channel all about biology, and this is Jyoti Verma. Today we are going to discuss about the difference between oxidative phosphorylation and substrate level phosphorylation. This is very important topic for your examination point of view. So let's start. So oxidative phosphorylation basically is the process of formation of ATP by the transfer of electrons from NADH or FADH2 to oxygen by a series of electron carriers. So oxidative phosphorylation basically deals up with your electron transport chain, which we have discussed earlier in our previous videos in detail. So in electron transport chain, what happens? The NADH or the FADH that are formed from the process of glycolysis as well as Krebs cycle are oxidized, and the electrons from these NADH and FADH2 are transferred through a series of electron carriers, and ultimately these are accepted by oxygen. During this process, a little amount of free energy is present in the form of a proton motive force that is ultimately converted into ATP by the enzyme which is called as the ATP synthase. So that's why this process is called as the oxidative phosphorylation, that is the formation of ATP in the presence of oxygen. Okay, so this is oxidative phosphorylation. And in substrate level phosphorylation, it is the process of formation of ATP by the transfer of phosphate group from a substrate to ADP. Okay, so a substrate that is carrying your phosphate group, it transfers that phosphate group to ADP, as a result of which there is formation of ATP. Okay, so the formation of ATP as a result of transfer of the phosphate group is termed as substrate level phosphorylation. So what is the difference between these two is that in the case of oxidative phosphorylation, you have the formation of ATP, but this formation of ATP is coupled with the transfer of electrons through a series of electron carriers. Okay. However, in the case of substrate level phosphorylation, there is direct generation of ATP, only there is transfer of phosphate group from a substrate to the ADP. So our next point is that oxidative phosphorylation occurs in the inner membrane of the mitochondria in the case of eukaryotes, as well as in the case of prokaryotes it takes place in the plasma membrane, because in the case of prokaryotes mitochondria is absent. So oxidative phosphorylation takes place within the plasma membrane in the case of prokaryotes, while on the other hand the substrate level phosphorylation takes place within the cytoplasm, because the glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm, and the substrate level phosphorylation also takes place within the mitochondrial matrix, that is in the Krebs cycle, because in the Krebs cycle we have also the formation of ATP. So this takes place in the eukaryotes, but in the case of prokaryotes, both the processes, the glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, are taking place in the cytoplasm of the cell. That's why substrate level phosphorylation takes place in the cytoplasm in the case of prokaryotes. Okay. So your oxidative phosphorylation is a kind of indirect phosphorylation, because there is formation of ATP, but that formation of ATP is coupled with the electron transport chain. However, the substrate level phosphorylation is the direct phosphorylation, because it simply involves the transfer of phosphate group from a substrate to ADP. It does not involve any kind of electron transport chain or any kind of proton motive force. So it is a kind of direct phosphorylation. However, oxidative phosphorylation is a kind of indirect phosphorylation. The oxidative phosphorylation takes place in the electron transport chain, and it is also called as the electron transport system. However, the substrate level phosphorylation takes place in the glycolysis as well as in the Krebs cycle. That is, there is formation of ATP in the glycolysis as well as there is direct generation of ATP within the Krebs cycle. We have already discussed in detail about the glycolysis as well as about the Krebs cycle in our previous videos. Next point is that in the oxidative phosphorylation, the NADH as well as the FADH2 are oxidized. So the NADH and the FADH2 that have been formed in the process of glycolysis as well as in the process of Krebs cycle are oxidized. That is, there is loss of electron from NADH and FADH2 that is transferred along the electron transport chain. However, in the case of substrate level phosphorylation, your NAD and FAD are reduced. That is, they gain an electron and that they ultimately convert into NADH and FADH in the case of substrate level phosphorylation. Okay, so these are the major differences between the oxidative phosphorylation and the substrate level phosphorylation. So let's discuss about the places where these are taking place in the glycolysis Krebs cycle as well as in the electron transport chain. So firstly we will discuss about the oxidative phosphorylation. So oxidative phosphorylation is a process of formation of ATP due to the transfer of electrons from the NADH to oxygen through a series of electron carriers. So the process of formation of ATP is coupled with the transfer of electrons through a series of chain. In the process of oxidative phosphorylation, NADH and FADH2 are oxidized. That is, there is loss of electrons from NADH and FADH2. Now let's talk about the substrate level phosphorylation. So your substrate level phosphorylation takes place within the glycolysis. In the glycolysis, the substrate level phosphorylation is the direct generation of ATP from a substrate containing a phosphate group. So a phosphate group from 1,3-bis phosphoglycerate is transferred to ADP, due to which ATP is formed, and that process is called as the substrate level phosphorylation. In glycolysis, this process takes place at the step 7 when 1,3-bis phosphoglycerate gives off its 1-phosphate to ADP, that ultimately leads to the formation of ATP. Okay, so there is substrate level phosphorylation in the case of Krebs cycle. At this step, when succinyl CoA gets converted into succinate. So in this process, a phosphate group from the succinyl CoA is transferred to the ADP, that ultimately leads to the formation of your ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So there is direct generation of ATP in the case of substrate level phosphorylation. So it is a kind of direct phosphorylation. So that is all about the difference between the oxidative phosphorylation and the substrate level phosphorylation. If you like the video, just subscribe to my channel for further updates. Thank you so much.